Welcome, one and all. My name is Dr. Georgia Satara. Thank you so much for joining me for this very brief history of the colonization of the lands currently known as Canada, with a few notes on approaches to decolonization. I have another lecture focusing on Indigenous proposals for decolonization coming soon. With this video, the focus is on mapping a quick overview of the history of colonialism in Canada. It's a history of the present, with the aim that understanding how we got to this historical moment will support Canadians to better understand their responsibilities moving forward. After all, how can Canadians get on board with decolonization if they don't know their own history? And to be clear, I am and will always be learning. I read Indigenous scholars, thinkers, and elders. I'm continuing to learn, and I'm just here to share some of my learning. There's so much to be said. 500 years of history, the top half of an entire continent. Still, I hope that it's a good beginning. Do let me know what your questions are, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll find it useful. Let's start with an internal inventory. As you listen, consider, what do you know about Canadian history, about the history of these lands? How did Canada gain sovereignty over these territories? That is, how did Canada come to have this land and its resources? What stories are you familiar with? When and where did you learn those stories? According to those stories, what kinds of worlds are possible? What's impossible? It's important to understand the power of stories to shape the world. As you listen, take note of what's new for you in this learning. I'd be keen to hear what you consider the three most important things you learned from this video. I know there's a lot here. I hope you will come back and listen to it again. Also, know that my PowerPoint is full of images, books, and movies. Often that's where the information from a given slide is coming from. So it's not just to make it pretty. There's lots of sources here for more learning. And as you listen, consider your relationship to this history. Where do you fit in? What are your responsibilities? Whose lands do you live on? What will you do with this knowledge? Let me know in the comments below. Let's start with some foundational definitions and ideas. What do I mean when I say colonialism? Colonialism refers to the taking of land and resources belonging to one nation to benefit another nation. Settler colonialism refers to the displacing of indigenous peoples by a newcomer population that settles on indigenous lands and intends to stay. This system is different from other colonial systems where the focus is only on the extraction of resources by outsiders. In addition to dispossessing indigenous peoples so that others may come into possession of their lands and resources, systems of settler colonialism attempt to erase or disappear indigenous peoples because settlers want to be the new natives. They want to be the new natives in order to have uncontested access and ownership of indigenous lands and resources. Patrick Wolf has encouraged us to understand colonialism as a structure, not an event. That means colonialism cannot be reduced to a moment of invasion. As long as settlers are in power, as long as their systems are in place and settlers remain in possession of indigenous lands and resources, colonialism is ongoing. When we talk about colonialism in Canada, it's important to be clear that each region has its own history. Contact and settlement happened at different times and different places, and even within one region, there are multiple histories because there are multiple Indigenous nations and complex histories within these nations. There's also, of course, change and continuity over time. It's important not to presuppose the past, meaning don't assume things happened in particular ways. It's also important not to assume that the way things are today are the way things have always been or that they're going to stay that way. As Angela Davis's mother reminds us, it's a complex and rich history. In case you need more definitions, I have linked the Settler Colonialism Primer in this slide. Now, let's turn to the history. So, how did European nations claim sovereignty, the right to rule over indigenous territories? An archaic 15th century Christian doctrine, the doctrine of discovery. In the 1400s, various popes over several decades issued these decrees, pronouncements, papal bulls that gave European Christian kings the right and power to claim the lands and resources and even the peoples of non Christian nations. The idea of terra nullius implied that the lands belonged to no one because non Christians did not count as human beings worthy of respect or sovereignty. Even though it was Catholic popes who issued these papal bulls, Protestants also used the doctrine of discovery to support their claims to Turtle Island, currently known as the continent of North America. So, the doctrine of discovery facilitated European Christian colonialism and domination of indigenous lands. And although the 1400s and 1490s are a really, really long time ago, the doctrine of discovery is still the grounds on which Canada claims sovereignty over these territories. In 2014, Canada's Supreme Court acknowledged that the doctrine of discovery is racist. After all, how is it possible that one nation's sovereignty can be automatically given to another nation? As John Burroughs writes in his book, Laws Indigenous Ethics, how can Canada claim to own Indigenous peoples' lands and resources where there are no treaties to that effect, which is the case for all of mainland British Columbia? So the Supreme Court of Canada rejected terra nullius in the Chilcotin case. The Chilcotin Nation has never given up their rights to their territories. But Burroughs' analysis shows that the Chilcotin Supreme Court decision kicked the doctrine of discovery out the front door and then managed to sneak it back in through the side window, or in this case, only to reaffirm it in the same paragraph of the decision, reasserting, quote, the Crown's radical title out of thin air, unquote. So it's the great Canadian way, say one thing and do another. More recently, after decades of mobilization by Indigenous peoples, led by Stephen Newcomb and Burger Kills Strait, the Pope Francis finally repudiated the doctrine of discovery in March of 2023. It's a good beginning. It's a history in the making. If you want to know more about the doctrine of discovery, there is a film subtitled Unmasking the Doctrine of Domination, which is available for streaming on the internet for a small fee. And then there's a silly film, hilarious Australian mockumentary, Barbecue Area, where Australian Aboriginals, quote unquote, discover whites and lay claim to their lands. It's available for viewing for free. Enjoy. An early example of the doctrine of discovery in action was in 1534 when Jacques Cartier erected a cross on Mohawk territory on lands now currently known as Quebec. It's a well-known story told in mainstream Canadian history books that Donnacona, a Mohawk chief, protested Cartier's arrogance and denounced his act. Donnacona asserted that the region belonged to his people and that the cross was erected without his permission. Cartier not only lied, claiming that the cross was a navigational aid, he kidnapped two of Donnacona's sons to bring them back to France as proof of his so-called discovery. Over 200 years later, another explorer, James Cook, sailed along the coast of the lands now known as British Columbia, and without setting foot on most of them, he claimed them for Britain. For that story, let's turn briefly to Arthur Manuel in his book Unsettling Canada, where he explains, quote, Europeans made their initial land claim on our Secwepemc lands in 1778 when Captain Cook sailed along the British Columbia coast more than 400 kilometers away from our territory. According to the tenets of discovery, all that Europeans had to do to expropriate the lands in a region was to sail past a river mouth and claim all the lands of its watershed. Our lands, given to us by our Creator and inhabited by us for thousands of years, were transformed into a British possession, not only without our consent and without our knowledge, but without a single European setting foot on our territory. Unquote. So I've given you a map here, and you could see Chilcotin territory that we talked about in the last slide, and there is Secwepemc lands that Arthur Manuel is talking about. You can see how far James Cook would have been from those territories. I've given you also a link here to how to pronounce Secwepemc. I'm also always learning. For an incredible read about Mohawk's ongoing refusal of colonialism, check out Audra Simpson's incredible book, Mohawk Interruptus. Settler scholar Edward Kavanagh takes up the question of how the doctrine of discovery worked beyond Cartier's claim. In New France, colonialism proceeded without recognition of indigenous rights or sovereignty. The new colonial regime, Kavanagh explains, granted land to settlers without purchase from indigenous peoples, without conquest, without ending indigenous title. The lands were treated as terra nullius, as if they belong to no one at the level of practice. That means that indigenous sovereignty was disregarded. Colonialism proceeded without the consent of indigenous peoples. To preempt the land means just to take it. So there was no ending of indigenous title. That means today, when you hear a land acknowledgement and the speaker says we are on unceded land, it means that the land was never surrendered by indigenous nations to whom those lands belong. So this possession is ongoing, as is the centrality of companies and corporations to colonialism and settlement. In New France, companies got royal permission to set up businesses to extract resources for maximum profits. Without the negotiation or consent of indigenous nations, companies and settlers came to have property rights and title as if by magic, according to Kavanaugh. And we could see that that process is ongoing. And one example is that the Coastal Gas Link was issued a permit by the governments of Canada and British Columbia to build a pipeline on Wet'suwet'en territory. If you want to know more about that, I've given you a link here to the film Yinta. So then, as now, Indigenous people continue to be sovereign on their lands. That's what Kavanaugh means when he says sovereignty is layered. Just because Europeans asserted rights doesn't mean that Indigenous peoples surrendered their homelands. Indigenous peoples continue to be sovereign in our own day. So, how do Europeans gain possession in addition to taking the land and handing out so called licenses to corporations? According to Kavanaugh, possession requires other Europeans to recognize European claims. European assertions of sovereignty also require having settlers on the land. That claiming the land requires so called actual possession. That means that Europeans claim lands, but to be able to hold those lands, they needed settlers on those lands who were loyal subjects to those European kings. And the American War of Independence is one example of what happens when settlers rebel against their colonial overlords. Colonial power also gets asserted over land through European ideas, literature, and knowledge production. For instance, philosopher John Locke argued that mixing labor with land makes ownership. As Audra Simpson writes, Europeans could not perceive indigenous nations' relations with their lands, nor did those relations matter to Europeans, and therefore, according to Locke, indigenous lands were up for grabs. In addition to philosophers and explorers, Kavanaugh suggests that historians are also responsible for emptying indigenous lands. By the way, the historians have written and told the history as if the lands were empty, as if the lands were so called unoccupied. He says historians write and act as frontier real estate agents. The way we tell stories has political consequences. For more about that, check out Harold Johnson's The Power of Story. One beloved story Canadians tell about themselves is that Canada is a peaceful nation. One part of that story is the myth of peaceful possession, the idea that historically Canada had peaceful dealings with Indigenous nations whose land Canada claims. In her unfortunately titled book, Canada's First Nations, Gregory Youngins cautions us against using possessive language. Indigenous nations are not owned and do not belong to Canada. More on that in my decolonization lecture. Anyhow, in her book, Dickinson has argued that despite this myth and Canadian pride of peaceful possession, two of the longest wars in the colonial history of North America took place in the lands claimed by Canada. One of those was led by Mohawks from 1609 to 1701, and the other was led by the Mi'kmaq from 1613 to 1761. Both of those resistance movements ended with peace treaties. More on the Mi'kmaq in a moment. These were wars that were fought intermittently, involved guerrilla tactics, skirmishes, and battles. So, in many ways, this resistance to colonial invasion is ongoing. It made the news in 1990 when the Mohawks stopped the expansion of a golf course into their sacred pines, and the Quebec police and then the Canadian Army laid siege to the community for 78 days, what has become known as the Oka Crisis. The film by Alanis Obomsawin, Kanasadage, 270 Years of Resistance, is available online, free for viewing. Ellen Gabriel, the spokesperson for her people at the time and a continuing leader and inspiration, has recently published her book, When the Pine Needles Fall, Indigenous Acts of Resistance. Gabriel also made a film on the crucial role of women in the 1990 resistance, something that has been eclipsed by media coverage. In her book, Gabriel argues, despite the many victories of the Mohawk resistance of 1990, the golf course was not expanded. Land fraud and colonial development on Mohawk lands continues and must end. Today, we have the European Union, which suggests unity among European nations. But from the 1400s and well into the 20th century, including both world wars, European nations were rivals, battling each other for supremacy. At the end of many of their wars with each other, Europeans also carved up the world and distributed amongst themselves without consultation or reference to the nations who lived in those lands. For instance, in 1700, the King of Spain died and he left his empire to his grandson Louis XIV. In 1702, England, Austria, most of Germany, Denmark, and Holland declare war in their struggle for power in Europe. The Spanish War of Succession, as it became known, ended with a peace treaty called the Treaty of Utrecht, which, among other things, gave England control over the north shore of Hudson's Bay, Acadia, lands now known as Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. France got Cape Breton Island, the St. Lawrence Valley, the interior south of Rupert's Land, check out the maps, extending all the way from Hudson's Bay to the Mississippi Valley and Louisiana. And all of this happened without consultation with any of the indigenous nations whose territories were distributed between France and England. So, under the Treaty of Utrecht, all Mi'kmaq became a British possession without consultation of any of these indigenous nations. The Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, now known as the Wolastoqiyik, Passamaquoddy, or the Abenaki. These nations' lands and sovereignty were transferred to Britain. When Britain attempted to assert its power on the ground in Mi'kmaq, lands now known as Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, part of Quebec, Indigenous nations resisted and fought the British on land and sea. That resistance brought Britain to peace treaties with the Mi'kmaq, and when Britain did not fulfill its treaty obligations, war and resistance resumed. In the first Peace and Friendship Treaty in 1725, the British acknowledged Mi'kmaq rights to their lands, hunting, and fishing. Treaties between the Mi'kmaq and the British created norms for peaceful coexistence, including an agreement that British settlement of Mi'kmaq territories would not proceed without Mi'kmaq consent. And then, in the aftermath of yet another war among Europeans, this time the War of Austrian Succession, in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, France gave up its conquests in the Netherlands and India in return for Louisbourg, which had been captured by the British in 1745. The British wanted their own fortified base in Nova Scotia, and in 1749, Edward Cornwallis arrived and founded Halifax on the shores of Timbuktu Bay without seeking or gaining permission or consent from the Mi'kmaq, for whom the building of Halifax was a serious encroachment on their lands. So the Mi'kmaq resumed their attacks on the British on land and sea. Then Cornwallis issued a scalp proclamation offering a bounty for every Mi'kmaq taken or killed upon producing their scalp. This is the context of the title of Elder Daniel Paul's book on Mi'kmaq history, We Were Not the Savages. The Mi'kmaq declared war on the British for attempting to settle their lands without permission and for attempting to exterminate them. This resistance was very expensive for the British. Parliament had issued some £39,000 for Nova Scotia in 1750, and Cornwallis had spent nearly £174,000 trying to fight the Mi'kmaq. More importantly, Mi'kmaq resistance significantly slowed British settlement in Mi'kma'ki and brought the British back to peace and friendship treaty talks, which resulted in the Treaty of 1752, which was renewed and reaffirmed in 1760 at the end of the Seven Years' War, again between the British and the French, always to ensure peace. We cannot underestimate the importance of peace to European settlement and prosperity on indigenous lands. From the outset, these treaties guaranteed the Mi'kmaq the right to fish. Nonetheless, in 1993, Donald Marshall was arrested for fishing eel. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which affirmed the Mi'kmaq treaty right to fish. Following the Supreme Court victory, the community went out to exercise their Supreme Court affirmed treaty right to fish, but the Canadian public, non-native fishers, did not respect the Supreme Court's decision. And Canadians mobilized with the backing of the Canadian States Arsenal in support of non-native fishers and against their own Supreme Court ruling. As lawyer Franklin Gertler describes in the film Is the Crown at War with Us, for viewing online, quote, the state brought its full force, police authority to bear with helicopters, patrol boats, guns, and observation by airplanes, RCMP detachments, dozens of RCMP cars, and so forth on the people of Eskanobovich, unquote. And this after the Supreme Court of Canada, a colonial court, affirmed Mi'kmaq treaty right to fish. The struggle for supremacy between the French and the English over the eastern part of Turtle Island, or North America, ended with France losing. Although Canadian historian W.J. Eccles, in his reappraisal of the British and French tactics at the final Battle of Quebec in 1759, has argued that, quote, the most overlooked determining factor in history has been stupidity, unquote. He says this in part because the commanders on each side, General Wolfe and Montcalm, both received mortal wounds and ended up dead at the end of this one battle. There's Wolfe on my slide, his death mythologized in a famous painting by Benjamin West. In his book, Imaginary Indian, this is how settler scholar Daniel Francis interprets the painting, and I quote, One of the most famous historical paintings ever done on a Canadian theme is The Death of General Wolfe by Benjamin West. The huge canvas depicts the English general James Wolfe expiring on the Plains of Abraham outside the walls of Quebec City. In the background, his triumphant army is capturing Canada for British arms. Wolfe lies prostrate in the arms of his grieving fellow officers. A messenger brings news of the victory, and with his last breath, the general gives thanks. The eye is drawn to the left foreground, where an Iroquois warrior squats, his chin resting contemplatively in his hand, watching as death claims his commander. The light shimmers on the Indian's bare torso, which looks as if it might be sculpted from marble. From its unveiling in London in spring of 1771, The Death of Wolfe was a sensation. It earned for its creator an official appointment as history painter to the king, and became one of the most enduring images of the British Empire, reproduced on tea trays, wall hangings, and drinking mugs. West himself completed 6 versions of the painting. Today, it still appears in history books as an accurate representation of the past. Yet, as a historical document, it is largely a work of fiction. In reality, Wolfe died apart from the field of battle. Only one of the men in the painting was actually present. Other officers who were present at the death refused to be included in the painting because they disliked General Wolfe so much. And the Indian? According to his biographers, Wolfe despised Native people, all of whom fought on the side of the French anyway, and certainly none would have been present at his death. But that didn't matter to Benjamin West. Unquote. Fascinating, right? Maps, too, like paintings, can function as colonial fictions, as imperial fantasies. When we look at the large swath of blue on the map of lands claimed by France, we need to be clear it's smoke and mirrors. The French may have had a smattering or scattering of forts in these territories, and they paid duty, rents, gifts, or tolls to indigenous nations to be on their lands. Indigenous nations retained their sovereignty over their territories despite what Europeans and their maps imagined, as the British learned when they attempted to take possession of indigenous lands claimed by the French without following diplomatic protocols like gift giving. As Ojibwe chief Minavavana declared, quote, Englishmen, although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us, unquote. So Britain's refusal to recognize indigenous sovereignty at the end of the Seven Years' War led to a resistance between indigenous nations and the British, sometimes known as Pontiac's resistance. When 9 of 11 British forts fell between May and June of 1763, the British came to treaty. For the history of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Treaty of Niagara of 1764, I rely on the work of Anishinaabe legal scholar John Burroughs, who argues that the English failure to understand and fulfill diplomatic obligations, such as giving of gifts necessary for peaceful coexistence, led to bloodshed and war. Quote, to alleviate the conflict, the Royal Proclamation was declared to clarify jurisdiction between First Nations and the Crown, unquote. So while the written proclamation was drafted by colonial powers, Burroughs argues that the spirit and intent of the agreement requires attending to the treaty negotiations with First Nations representatives at Niagara in 1764. In addition to the Anishinaabe hosts and representatives of British Crown, approximately 2,000 First Nations leaders attended, over 24 Indigenous nations, with representative regions from across the continent, as far east as Nova Scotia, from Mississippi region in the west, as far north as Hudson's Bay. The Treaty of Alliance and Peace established by the parties at Niagara included the principles of Indigenous sovereignty, alliance, free trade, gift giving, peace and friendship, and respect. These principles were recorded in a two-row wampum belt used by First Nations to reflect their understanding of the Treaty of Niagara and the Royal Proclamation. Burroughs quotes Robert A. Williams Jr., a leading Native legal academic, who explains, quote, when the Haudenosaunee first came into contact with the Eastern nations, treaties of peace and friendships were made. Each was symbolized by the Gus Wenta or two-row wampum. There is a bed of white wampum, which symbolizes the purity of the agreement. There are two rows of purple, and those two rows have the spirit of your ancestors and mine. There are three beads of wampum separating the two rows, and they symbolize peace, friendship, and respect. These two rows will symbolize two paths or two vessels traveling down the same river together. One, a birch bark canoe, will be for the Indian people, their laws and their customs and their ways. The other, a ship, will be for the white people, their laws, their customs, and their ways. We shall each travel the river together side by side, but in our own boat. Neither of us will try to steal the other's vessel. Unquote. As Burroughs explains, First Nations and the Crown came to these negotiations with different aspirations. Quote, Britain attempted to secure territory and jurisdiction through the proclamation, while First Nations were concerned with preserving their lands and sovereignty. Unquote. The Royal Proclamation was clear. The settlement of Indigenous lands could not proceed without treaty with the Crown. But as Burrough explains, quote, while the proclamation seemingly reinforced First Nations preferences, that First Nations territories remain free from settlement or imposition, the Royal Proclamation also opened the door to its erosion. Unquote. Let's take a look. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was not only the basis of a peace agreement between the British and Indigenous nations, it was also the first British constitution to rule Quebec after the British defeat of the French in the Seven Years' War. You can see the British designation of the territories on the first map provided a large swath of land designated as Indian Territory, which, as we've just discussed, meant that there could be no settlement there without the Crown entering into treaty with Indigenous nations. Historians argue that the British hoped expansionist Americans would go north to Quebec to facilitate the British takeover rather than go west. That never happened. This failure, along with other developments, led to the Quebec Act of 1774, the second British constitution to rule Quebec. The Quebec Act redrew and expanded the boundaries of Quebec and significantly diminished those designated as Indian Territory. Meanwhile, American grievances against British rule mounted, which included the Quebec Act because it gave the West to Quebec, which Americans saw as their own inheritance. These grievances led to the American War of Independence, 1775 to 1783, which the British lost. British North America became confined to the northern part of the continent, and all those Americans who had fought on the side of the British, known as loyalists, had to leave American soil, given that their actions now were treasonous, having fought and supported the British losing side. Thousands of those loyalists fled north. They established New Brunswick in 1784 and the lands now known as Ontario, ushering in the third British Constitution to rule Quebec, the Constitution of 1791. That's the history of how Ontario was established. Appearing to follow the Royal Proclamation, Crown representatives signed a number of treaties with various Anishinaabe First Nations, but rather than agreements to provide benefits for Indigenous nations who were sharing their lands with newcomers, the Crown then as now interpreted those treaties as land purchases or land surrenders. Historian Arthur J. Ray argues, and he's a settler, that the treaties of Upper Canada were merely an illusion that colonial officials were abiding by the rules of the Royal Proclamation. Officials made verbal concessions like the right to fish and hunt, promises that the Crown ignored. Very quickly, indigenous peoples were outnumbered by immigrants whose settlement, sawmill development, poaching, and ecological transformation of colonial agriculture eroded indigenous peoples' land base, the land base they needed for hunting, trapping, and fishing. Rather than sharing the land, settlers actually ran indigenous people off their own lands. For those histories, I really encourage you to read Doug Williams' Mishi Sagig Nishutnabeg. This is Our Territory, a beautiful book. Leanne Simpson's As We Have Always Been. Very interesting histories. What happens in Ontario is one example of what Arthur Manuel suggests in Unsettling Canada. He writes, quote, when circumstances force Europeans to make concessions, as was the case with the Royal Proclamation of 1763 that recognized Indigenous sovereignty, the next generation would take advantage of a resurgence of its strength to reverse the concessions and to push Indigenous peoples further into poverty and dependence. In 1867, Canada became a nation. That's a small portion of present day Quebec, a small portion of present day Ontario, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. If we imagine nation building to be some kind of romantic union between peoples with a shared history, heritage, and culture, this was not it. For various political, economic, and geopolitical reasons, and a lot of booze, Canada became a nation. Why booze? The Maritimes, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island held a conference in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, to consider a maritime union, and the Canadians, John A. Macdonald representing Ontario, George Etienne Cartier representing Quebec, crashed the talks with $13,000 worth of champagne, $200,000 worth of booze in today's money, and persuaded Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to join them in Confederation instead. Prince Edward Island waited to join until 1873. From its inception, Canada was expansionist. Promoters of Confederation imagined a nation from sea to sea. Like Americans, Canadians saw the West as their inheritance. British claims to the West began with Henry Hudson, who named Hudson's Bay after himself in 1611. In 1668, the British king commissioned two French explorers, Menard de Groseilliers and Pierre Esprit Radisson, to map the river mouths and surrounding land of the Hudson's Bay. Mapping was a way of claiming those lands. Then, King Charles II gave the Hudson's Bay Company a charter to operate a business, a fur trade monopoly, on those indigenous territories. Headed by the king's cousin Rupert, the lands were renamed Rupert's Land in his honor. You can't make this stuff up. Canada became a nation in 1867 rather, and then in 1869, the Hudson's Bay Company transferred Rupert's Land to Canada for £300,000. All of this, the making of Canada, the transfer of the West from one colonial entity to another, from Britain to the Hudson's Bay Company to Canada. All of that happened without consultation or negotiation with any of the 60 Indigenous nations whose territories Canada claimed. This history is brilliantly illustrated by Kent Monkman's painting centering his alter ego, Mischief Eagle Testicle, in the famous painting of the Fathers of Confederation, reframed by Monkman as the Daddies. Mischief Eagle interrupts the Daddies' discussions with a reminder of Indigenous peoples, their title to the lands, their sovereignty on the lands claimed by Canada. Further, although the transfer of Rupert's Land to Canada, Canada agreed to honor the Royal Proclamation and to sign treaties with Indigenous nations, the two-year-old nation of Canada attempted to bypass the treaty process by sending in a new governor to the west without negotiating with local inhabitants. The Métis turned MacDougall back, and set up a provisional government led by Louis Riel at Red River in present-day Winnipeg. This became known as the Red River Resistance of 1869-1870. At that time, Canada agreed to negotiate, and the result was the Manitoba Act, which created Manitoba as a postage stamp of a province, super tiny, and it also guaranteed Métis land holdings and put aside 1.4 million hectares for Métis children. Métis scholar Adam Gaudry suggests that we understand the Manitoba Act as a treaty. It was negotiated with Métis people, being central to the new province and having their lands intact, but that it was implemented by Canada unilaterally, prioritizing settler access to land and establishing a settler dominated government. In addition, despite promises of amnesty, Louis Riel, who was elected 3 times to the House of Commons, was never allowed to take his seat. So, as the ink is drawing on the negotiations, Canada sends in the Wolseley expedition, some 1,200 soldiers for a so-called peaceful transfer of power. Historians do not agree on much, but they do agree that with the arrival of Wolseley's troops and in the aftermath, there was a reign of terror. They don't agree about why it happened, but they do agree that it did result in the clearing of the Métis from the original settlement belt. That means that 90% of those Métis who had lived in Red River actually were dispersed and went further west. You should know that it was not until 2013, after a 30-year battle in the courts, that the Supreme Court of Canada agreed with the Manitoba Métis Federation that the Manitoba Act had not been fulfilled. The 1.4 million acres set aside for Métis children ended up in settler hands. This issue is still without resolution. It was Indigenous leaders who insisted on the treaties. Indigenous nations turned back settlers, demanded rents, prevented the construction of telegraph lines, and interfered with the geological survey. This resistance to settlement without treaty led to the so-called numbered treaties. Check out the map to see the various territories designated by each treaty. Each treaty has its own history, and within one treaty, there are multiple negotiations and adhesions over time with different nations, each with their own history. Despite all that complicated narrative and history, there is an overarching understanding among Indigenous peoples who came to treaty that these were peace agreements, sharing the lands in exchange for certain benefits. Alexander Morris, the lieutenant governor and chief negotiator on behalf of the Crown and the new Canadian state, left us a written record of the treaty negotiations. You can find his book online. There's a huge gap between the written negotiations where Alexander Morris presented himself as his brother's keeper and promised that what he offered to Indigenous nations was an addition to rather than in place of what they already had. But what Morris described and the content of the treaty texts are two entirely different things. The treaty texts describe the treaties as land surrenders. In the book Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan, Our Dream is that our peoples will one day be clearly recognized as nations, elders maintain that such an extinguishment was never agreed to by First Nations during treaty negotiations of Treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10. In recent years, quote, at focus sessions when the extinguishment clauses of the written treaties are read and translated and explained, elders react with incredulity and disbelief. They find it hard to believe, quote, that anyone, much less the Crown, could seriously believe that First Nations would have agreed to extinguish their God-given rights, unquote. In 1876, Canada consolidated the Indian Act, a body of legislation to administer Indigenous peoples as wards of the state. It's important to note that the Indian Act was never mentioned in Morris's account of the negotiations of Treaty 6, which took place in that same year. In the 1870s, the buffalo as a free roaming species was disappearing. Some Indigenous leaders came to the treaty negotiations, like Big Bear, Mistahe Muskwa, to counsel settler representatives to control their own people's reckless destruction of the buffalo herds. Settlers had neither man made nor God given law to stop their wanton killing of the buffalo. Other leaders came to discuss a peaceful sharing of the land with the newcomers to the depth of a plow for settlers to farm in exchange for benefits, which included implements, seed, farming instruction to ensure Indigenous people's own survival when the buffalo was no more. And by 1879, on the lands claimed by Canada, and by 1883, on the American side of the border, the buffalo as a free roaming species had disappeared. Treaty 6 leaders negotiated a famine clause in 1876 in case of that eventuality. But in 1882, when pressed by liberals in the House of Commons about his government's spending in the newly acquired Northwest, John A. Macdonald, Canada's Prime Minister, is on record stating, quote, that he thinks that the Indian agents are doing all they can by refusing food until the Indians are on the verge of starvation to reduce the expense, unquote. Historian John Tobias in 1883 used government records to show that Canadian officials used food to subjugate the Cree. And most recently, James Dashak has told this history in the book Clearing the Plains Disease, the Politics of Starvation, and the Loss of Aboriginal Life. Meanwhile, the Métis who had dispersed from Red River had settled along the South Saskatchewan River. They faced displacement by settlers again and sought the return of Louis Riel, who had been making a living as a schoolteacher in Montana, to negotiate on their behalf. Riel returned, established a provisional government as he had in 1869, but in 1885 the Canadian state did not negotiate. They sent in 3 military columns to crush Riel, to put down what they called the Northwest Rebellion. At his trial, Louis Riel argued that his people's resistance could not be treason. It could not be a rebellion because Canada was an invader. The Northwest was the Métis' mother, and the people had a right to defend their homelands. Nonetheless, Louis Riel was found guilty of high treason and hanged in 1885. Historians now argue that the state labeled sporadic acts of violence by individuals as rebellion to decapitate the leadership for treaty reform, to subjugate Indigenous peoples, to disarm them, confine them to reserves with the past system in order to take over their lands and resources. For this history, see Blair Stonechild and Bill Waser's book, Loyal to Death, Till Death. In the aftermath of 1885, Sarah Carter's work using official documents shows that Indigenous reserve farming was successful, but it was undercut by government policy because incoming settlers did not want to share the market with Indigenous peoples. With the peasant farming policy, government officials used racist arguments to make it illegal for Indigenous peoples to use machinery that they had bought on their own farms. When their lands were turned by settlers into the breadbasket of the world, Indigenous people were legislated to use only hand tools. The only historical agreements, which later came to be known as treaties in the lands now known as British Columbia, were negotiated between 1850 and 1854, 20 years before BC joined Canada. The Hudson's Bay Fort in Victoria was only established in 1843. The colony of Victoria in 1849, when Britain leased Vancouver Island to the Hudson's Bay Company. Does that sound as weird to you as it does to me? Those 14 agreements were negotiated between James Douglas, there he is on my slide, um, and the chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company, and later the governor of the colony, and some First Nations in mostly the southern part of Vancouver Island. Check out the map I've provided on the slide. As is usual for the Canadian state, the official interpretation of these agreements is that they were land surrenders, even though the agreements were blank pages where the text was added afterwards. According to Douglas, the Lekwungen, quote, the Lekwungen exchanged their land for a sum of 300 blankets for each male head of family, with additional blankets to chiefs for a total price of 371 blankets plus one cap, unquote. So consider that in March of 1843, 7 years earlier, local Songhees provided cedar logs from nearby Mount Picols to form palisades for the Hudson's Bay Fort. They were paid one Hudson's Bay blanket for every 40 logs supplied. Why would Songhees exchange their lands for 300 blankets? As David Latasse, Sarlip elder, said in a 1934 interview published in the Times Colonist, the Hudson's Bay Company and the government actually owed the tribes rent for 80 years of occupation of Wasanich lands. He explained that the gifts they received were annual dues and trade gifts rather than a one-time payment for the land. I really appreciate this book, To Share Not Surrender, and the title captures the intent of First Nations who engaged in the treaty process. In Neil Valence's important essay in this collection, which focuses on First Nations accounts of the Vancouver Island treaties, he also quotes two settler scholars, James Tully, a philosopher who says, quote, Canada is founded on an act of sharing that is almost unimaginable in its generosity, unquote, and anthropologist Michael Ash, who argues, quote, the Crown asked for permission to share the land, not to transfer the authority to govern it, unquote. Sharing agreements rather than land surrenders. I have included a link to Wasanich Elder David Elliott Sr.'s book, The Saltwater People, and Jody Olson's YouTube discussion on the Wasanich Treaty of 1852, both of them available online if you want to check them out. Two more things. There's no consensus among historians about why James Douglas stopped signing treaties in 1854. We do know that land dispossession continued, settlers preempted land and acted as landlords rather than guests, and when Indigenous peoples enacted their own laws on newcomers, James Douglas pointed his gunboats on villages and hung warriors who defended their lands. For that history, see Chris Arnett's The Terror of the Coast, Land Alienation and Colonial War on Vancouver Island and Gulf Islands, 1749 to 1863. Let's bring this story to the present. In 1887, the Nisga'a traveled to Victoria from their homelands in Nass Valley to meet with colonial officials who laughed at the idea that the Nisga'a sovereignty and title. It took the Supreme Court of Canada until 1973 in the Calder case to agree that Indigenous people have title to their lands, what the court called Indian or Aboriginal title. The Nisga'a finally reached an agreement in the year 2000, the first modern treaty to be signed in British Columbia. To do so, the Nisga'a had to give up 92% of their lands. Despite residential schools being in the news in recent years, I'm not sure what Canadians know about them, and the more recent denial about these schools suggests that there is so much Canadians need to know and learn and understand about this history. Consider the beautiful 8-year-old Saulteaux Thomas More Cusick at the top of left of my slide. from Muskopetung First Nation, who was sent to Regina Residential School in 1891. According to Louise Big Eagle, at 12 years of age, Cusick contracted tuberculosis at the school. He was sent home where he died shortly thereafter. The picture, this famous picture of Thomas More Cusick, was taken between 1893 and 1895. When the Department of Indian Affairs used this photo of Cusick in 1897 to show the success of the residential school project, Cusick had already passed away from a disease that will kill thousands of Indigenous children in those schools. As early as 1907, Medical Officer for Indian Affairs Dr. Peter Bryce visited the schools and reported on their deadly conditions. Rather than implement Bryce's recommendations for reforms, Duncan Campbell Scott, who became Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, pushed Bryce out of public office in 1921. The following year, Bryce self-published his findings in a pamphlet entitled A National Crime, where he described this procession of Indigenous children from schools to the cemetery. His 24-page pamphlet is available online. Duncan Campbell Scott himself admitted that, quote, 50% of the children who passed through these schools did not live to benefit from the education they received from them, unquote. His concern and priority was, quote, to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic and there is no Indian question, unquote. This is what scholars now call the colonial project of Indigenous disappearance and genocide. This is about newcomers becoming the new natives and not having anybody to contest settler supremacy and sovereignty on these lands. The Indian Act was amended first in 1894 and in 1920 to make attendance at residential schools compulsory and to make it a crime for parents to resist the forcible removal of their children. As historian Mary Ellen Kelm writes, quote, the struggle between the school's commitment to cultural imperialism and First Nations' ability to mitigate the forces of that imperialism were inscribed on the bodies of children who experienced residential schooling, unquote. In 1920, the Indian Act was also amended to ban Indigenous traditional governance and hereditary chiefs. In 1923, Haudenosaunee Chief Tuskegee, Levi General, went to the newly formed League of Nations in Switzerland, now the UN, to bring Canada's violations of Indigenous sovereignty and land theft to the international community. Britain and Canada successfully lobbied and barred his access on the grounds that these were domestic rather than international matters. But how could a system which dispossessed Indigenous people, including of their children, provide justice? Work at the international level resumed in the 1970s and resulted in the current United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In response to ongoing Indigenous resistance, Canada amended the Indian Act in 1927 to make it illegal for Indigenous peoples to hire lawyers and organize politically. Despite criminalization, some of those organizations went underground. Indigenous people continued to mobilize and were successful in repealing that amendment in 1951. After these 1951 amendments, it would take between 1959 until 1996 and 1997 for the last residential school to close. Why target the children? Tamara Starblackett explains it was because the colonizers wanted to take the lands and resources. This is an important piece that's missing from the news coverage. The Canadian state, with the help of the churches and other colonial institutions, including social workers, went after the children to get the land. Cindy Blackstock, Gitsan, is a modern day hero, pictured here with Spirit Bear on my slide. She is the executive director of the First Nations and Family Caring Society. The fact is that the state removal of Indigenous children is ongoing. Now, rather than residential schools, Indigenous children are removed by child welfare. The federal government does not provide sufficient resources for Indigenous children to stay safely in their homes. While there's no funding cap for children removed from their homes, child maltreatment prevention services available to other Canadians are not available to children on reserves. The result is that Indigenous children are about 15 times more likely to be placed in foster care than non-Indigenous youth. In 2021, Indigenous children accounted for 7.7% of children under the age of 15 in Canada, but they are more than half, 53.8% of all foster children. In 2007, Blackstock filed the complaint with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal because the federal government's underfunding of child welfare on reserves. It took 9 years for the tribunal to find in the children's favor, a childhood Blackstock reminds us. Then, rather than fix it, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau appealed the Human Rights Tribunal decision. Since then, Blackstock has taken the federal government to court for non-compliance over 28 times since the 2016 win, including on Jordan's Principle, which is meant to ensure that Indigenous children will get the life-saving health care they require. The struggle is ongoing. For more information and about how to support, please check out Cindy Blackstock and the First Nation and Family Caring Society website, including the film We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice, which is available free online. As Arthur Manuel makes clear in the book Unsettling Canada, quote, nothing Indigenous people have ever gained has ever been given to us without a fight, unquote. Glenn and Sean Coulthardt's brilliant book, Red Skin, White Masks, provide a timeline that helps us to understand Arthur Manuel's point and our current moment. So, in 1990, the first lawsuit from a former residential school student was launched, which would become a class action suit by 70,000 former students. 1990 was also the year of the siege of Kanasatake, the so-called Oka Crisis. Its standing committee recommended Canada launch a Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which published its findings in 1996, and it called for an inquiry into residential schools. The class action suit by former students led to the 2007 Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which provided meager financial compensation to some former students. The agreement required the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2008. It was in this context that Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued a public apology for residential schools in June of 2008, only to declare that, quote, Canada has no history of colonialism at a G20 meeting in September of 2009, the following year. Coulthard argues that Harper's apology was symbolic, a performative gesture to whitewash Canada's image to produce conditions to secure international financial stability and investment. Harper's apology never named colonialism. It projected residential schools as an isolated issue that happened in the past rather than as part of an ongoing colonial process. Coulthard argues that the apology was a way to relieve Canadians of responsibility. The TRC heard thousands of hours of testimony by residential school survivors, but could not press charges against them or even name wrongdoers in their report. In fact, the TRC never made a connection between residential schools and the taking of the land. Coulthard makes the compelling argument for Canada, reconciliation is a way to, quote, render consistent Indigenous assertions of nationhood with the state's unilateral assertion of sovereignty over Native peoples' lands and populations, unquote. So, what does that mean in everyday language? Canada uses reconciliation as a way to appear like it's recognizing Indigenous nations, while Canada continues to assert its sovereignty over Indigenous peoples, their lands, and resources. Glenn Sean Coulthard argues that Harper's apology is part of a quote unquote global industry where the world's nations appear to be coming to terms with their horrible past in this age of truth and reconciliation. Jeff Corntassel and Cindy Holder, in their article, Who's Sorry Now? Government Apologies, Truth Commissions, and Indigenous Self Determination in Australia, Canada, Guatemala, and Peru, quote a story by Andrew Rigby, director of the Center for Peace and Reconciliation Studies, where he refers to symbolic gestures as cheap reconciliation and illustrates the logic of this strategy with a story by Reverend McCloskey and Bambani. These two friends, Peter and John, one day Peter steals John's bicycle. Then, after a period of some months, he goes to John with outstretched hand and says, let's talk about reconciliation. And John says, no, let's talk about my bicycle. Forget about the bicycle for now, Peter says. Let's talk reconciliation. No, replies John. We cannot talk about reconciliation until you return my bicycle. As Corntassel and Holder suggest in the above example, the victim is being asked to become reconciled to loss rather than a reconciliation as a transformation of relations, returning the bicycle, returning the land, and transferring power back to Indigenous nations. Coulthard argues that the Canadian state, in its reconciliation talk, attempts to make a distinction between a quote unquote bad or quote unquote dark past and a democratic, enlightened present, as if the past and the present are very different things. But that change hasn't taken place. Colonialism is ongoing. The colonial system has not been dismantled. The language is changing, but the political outcomes, the distribution of power is the same. So the state and the crown hold title over Indigenous lands. And even when Canada's own Supreme Court rules in favor of Indigenous nations, the state is given the legal right to infringe, to violate Indigenous title, territories, and resources for many reasons, including quote unquote conservation, settlement, development, and settler interests. So, what is needed? Drawing on Taiga Alfred's work, Coulthard argues that we need to transform the structure of dispossession, the system of violence to transform relationships, that there needs to be massive restitution of land to Indigenous nations, including financial transfers and compensation for past and present. There needs to be redistribution of land and resources, as well as a renewed treaty process. There needs to be a transfer of authority from the state to Indigenous nations. If you're interested in learning more about decolonization strategies and proposals by Indigenous leaders, please join me where I'm going to be looking at all of these books and more to talk about Indigenous proposals and settler responsibilities for decolonization in an upcoming lecture. The heart of what we're talking about is land back. If you want to understand more about that, I've given you a reading here by Tuck and Yang and this link. Decolonization is not a metaphor, free online. I've also given you a link to a fact sheet distilling Tuck and Yang in 2 pages. I've given you a short lecture here by Ellen Gabriel, who says, how do we move forward? And she says, respect Indigenous people, no dispossession of land. Settlers need to ask permission. Settlers need to honor and live up to agreements. And part of that is learning the real history of this nation. I hope that this lecture has been part of that learning for you. course, there's all this essential reading, including the 1996 RCAP recommendations, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and the TRC's 94 calls to action. If you want to join me for more on decolonization, I'll see you in my next lecture. I hope that this history of colonialism has been really useful to you. Please let me know what you learned and what's important for you here. I hope that my work has been meaningful. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it.